The first person in Cutter's Bend, Montana Territory, to call Hannah Brindle a wood-hoarding fool was her own sister-in-law, a 32-year-old woman named Edna Poole with tightly pulled-back ash-blonde hair coiled in a severe bun, sharp pale gray eyes, and narrow lips that pressed thinner every time she watched Hannah split another log. Edna wore a dark moss-green wool dress buttoned to her collarbone, a black wool shawl pinned with a tarnished silver brooch, and carried herself with the particular rigidity of a woman who had never once bent to circumstance. She stood 5'4", lean in the shoulders, with a long, thin face and pale, reddened cheeks that flushed further whenever she spoke Hannah's name with a tone of disgust. The boots she wore were dark brown leather, button-fastened from ankle to knee, and she took precise steps wherever she moved through Cutter's Bend, each one a small judgment. It was the autumn of 1886 when Edna first came to the abandoned trapper's cabin where Hannah had begun her work, and what she saw would become the foundation of a resentment that would outlast every mockery she could muster. Hannah Brindle was 24 years old, thin from grief, wearing a faded calico dress and her dead husband's canvas work gloves, and she was splitting cordwood in the fading light with a 6-pound maul. The sound of the maul striking wood echoed across the hillside, a sharp crack that split the afternoon quiet, and Edna watched for 3 minutes without speaking. When Hannah finally drove the maul into one last round and looked up, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the autumn chill, Edna spoke in a voice like flint-scraping stone. "You'll kill yourself doing that kind of work, and for what? So you can sit in a warm cabin that isn't even yours?" Hannah did not answer. She had learned already, in the 4 months since her husband Thomas had died of pneumonia, that Edna's words were not truly questions. They were pronouncements. Edna had inherited the family cabin, the good cabin, the one Thomas's father had built with stone and timber, the one with glass windows and a steady hearth. Hannah, as a widow with no family of her own and no claim to Thomas's estate, had been left with nothing. An old trapper named Corbeau had abandoned his one-room shelter at the edge of town 3 years prior and moved south to Denver, and the cabin had sat empty since, its roof sound enough, its walls holding back the wind. Hannah had begun her life there on the day of Thomas's burial, and begun her work the day after. The first day she had split wood, Edna had said, "You're building a funeral pyre for yourself." The second day, when Hannah continued, Edna had remarked, "There are only so many hours of daylight, and you're wasting them." By the third week, Edna had taken her campaign to the town. She told anyone who would listen that Hannah was in the grip of a peculiar madness, that grief had unmoored her from reason. She was stacking her life away, as Edna put it, spending her days in meaningless repetition while her body grew thin and her mind turned strange. The people of Cutter's Bend, Montana Territory, numbered no more than 140 souls. The town had grown up around a sawmill 5 miles to the west, and its permanent residents were a mix of merchants, a doctor, a school teacher, families who had staked claims to grazing land, and men who worked the timber. Word moved through the town like smoke. Within a month, Edna Poole's version of Hannah's story had become the dominant narrative. The widow at the edge of town, burning away her final years in pointless labor. Some people said it with pity. Some said it with concern. Edna said it with something sharper, something that sounded like satisfaction whenever she used the word fool. Hannah did not attend church on Sundays to defend herself. She did not walk into town and argue her case. Instead, she continued to split and stack. She worked from sunrise to the moment when the light became too dim for safety, and she worked in a particular way that had nothing to do with accident or hysteria. Every log she split was sized to a specific length, 16 inches. Every log she stacked followed a pattern she was building in her mind, a design that had emerged from somewhere deeper than conscious choice. It was a design born from memory. Hannah's grandmother had lived in Duluth, Minnesota, and had survived the Great Blizzard of January 1873. The storm that had come out of the northwest with a wind so fierce that it seemed the earth itself was being unmade. The blizzard had lasted 3 days, and the temperature had fallen to 18 degrees below zero, and the snow had piled higher than the roof lines of houses. Many people had died that winter, and many more would have died if not for the preparations made in the weeks before the snow. Hannah's grandmother, a woman named Margaret Thorne, with white hair she wore in a braid down her back and hands that had never stopped moving, had kept a 6-year rolling reserve of firewood on her property. She never burned green wood. She never cut wood in the autumn. She never allowed herself the comfort of thinking that winter might be mild enough to need less fuel. Instead, in the long summers of the northern plains, she split and stacked with the precision of a woman building a fortress against an enemy that was always, always coming. The grandmother had taught Hannah, during the summers Hannah spent with her after her own parents had died, that cold is patient. It will outlast every fire you light unless you stack faster than winter burns. Margaret Thorne had said this while standing in her own wood lot outside Duluth, a 1/4 acre of stacked timber so neat and so vast that it looked like a wall built against the horizon. The grandmother had survived not only the blizzard, but the years that followed it, years when families who had lost their fuel reserves during the storm found themselves starting from nothing, years when the price of a cord of split hardwood in Duluth rose to $7 and families chose between heat and food. Margaret had never faced that choice. She had her 6-year reserve, and she had replenished it every spring and summer with the discipline of a soldier fortifying a position. She rose before dawn to split. She stacked until her shoulders locked, and she rested only when the light failed. The grandmother had a birch bark journal with firewood tallies going back 30 years, a handwritten record of every cord split, every cord stacked, every cord burned, the date of every first snow and every last frost, the number of days below zero each winter, and the number of cords consumed between November and March. She kept the journal on a shelf in her bedroom, and she would review it each spring, checking and rechecking her arithmetic, making notes about the weather of the previous winter, calculating what the next winter might demand. Hannah had held that journal in her hands when she was 12 years old, tracing the careful pencil marks with her fingertip, and she had understood even then that the journal was not a record of numbers, but a record of survival. The grandmother's method was absolute. Split wood in April when the sap was running and the wood came apart clean. Stack wood in May when the days were long and dry. Let it season until December, 8 months minimum, and only then begin to burn. Never touch a piece of wood that had not had at least one full summer of air and wind moving through the stack. The grandmother had showed Hannah the rings in a piece of green wood, still moist from the stump, and then the rings in a piece that had been stacked for 2 years, dry as bone. She had Hannah hold one in each hand and feel the difference in weight. The green piece was heavy as a stone. The seasoned piece was light as bread. "The water holds cold," Margaret Thorne had said. "Wood won't warm anything until it has released its water. You can burn green wood and waste heat going into evaporation, or you can wait and let the wind do your burning for free. Hannah had carried that lesson with her from Duluth to her marriage, from her marriage to her widowhood, and from her widowhood to the abandoned trapper's cabin at the edge of Cutter's Bend, where she would put it to use for the first time in her life. By the summer of 1887, the village of Cutter's Bend had come to understand that Hannah Brindle was not engaged in grief-fueled hysteria. She was engaged in something far more deliberate. She had, in the months after arriving at the trapper's cabin, identified an old, collapsed barn about a quarter-mile away, and she had salvaged and modified its materials. She had studied the hillside behind the cabin, where a natural rise in the ground created a sheltered pocket. She had made marks with charcoal on the rocks, and she had begun to dig. The vault emerged slowly over weeks and months. It was 40 feet long, 12 feet wide, 8 feet tall, large enough to hold 50 cords of firewood, though Hannah had not announced this dimension to anyone. The walls she dug were stone-lined, packed with clay, and reinforced with timber at the corners. The foundation was a series of stone piers that elevated the wood 6 inches above the ground, keeping it off the damp earth. At each end of the vault, Hannah cut air shafts, 2 at the north end and 2 at the south, lined with stacked stone that would allow a cross breeze to move through the entire structure. The roof she engineered with care. She used salvaged timbers to create a frame, and then she covered it with sod, thick layers of earth and roots, but she left a 6-inch gap at the ridgeline for ventilation. Over the sod, she placed split cedar shingles that would shed water without trapping moisture. She hung iron-hinged double doors at the entrance, doors wide enough that a sled could pass through, and she treated them with oil she had made by rendering fat from a deer she had shot and butchered on her own. Every detail of the vault was calculated. The stacking method, alternating layers at 90-degree angles to every layer beneath, created maximum airflow while maximizing density. Hannah sorted the wood by type as she stacked it. The dense lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, the woods that burned long and steady and hot, went on the left wall. The lighter birch and cottonwood, the kindling woods that caught quickly, went on the right. The top layer of every section was stacked bark side up, so that water would shed away from the wood beneath. Above each segment, on the beam that ran the length of the vault, Hannah carved a tally mark with a knife, 1 mark per cord. 200 marks, eventually, would fill that beam completely, but she would never reach that number. 50 cords was the limit the vault could hold, and that was a number that staggered anyone who understood wood. A cord is a volume of 128 cubic feet, a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 8 feet long. 50 cords was 6,400 cubic feet of solid material. It was enough wood to heat a house through an entire winter with room to spare. It was, in the towns and settlements of the Montana Territory, an incomprehensible abundance. Edna Poole had watched the vault emerge with an expression that grew increasingly contemptuous. She came out to the cabin 3 separate times during the construction, her wool skirts muddy, her silver brooch catching the light, and each time she found some aspect of Hannah's work to ridicule. "You're digging a grave," she said once, "a grave for money and labor." Another time she said, "This is the obsession of an unbalanced mind," and the tone made clear she intended it to be reported. It was. By the summer of 1888, much of Cutter's Bend had heard, through the network of gossip that bound the town together, that Hannah Brindle was building an underground tomb for Firewood because her grief had detached her from sanity. Some people said this with the tone of someone sharing a cautionary tale. Others said it with a kind of horrified fascination. The doctor had remarked to the schoolteacher that a person would need to be quite disconnected from reality to imagine that any single winter would require such a quantity of fuel. The schoolteacher, who was a young woman from back east and tended to measure her words carefully, had said only that Hannah seems very determined. Edna had said, in the presence of at least a dozen people at the general store, "She is wasting away, and she will die alone in that cabin, surrounded by all that wood, and the wood will not keep her warm because she will have died, and that is the end of the story that waiting will bring her." The years of work did not stop. Hannah continued to split and stack. By the end of 1888, she had completed 42 cords in the vault. By the spring of 1889, she had added 4 more, bringing the total to 46. She had planned in the back of her mind, where she kept the knowledge that had come from her grandmother, to add 2 more in the early summer, and then rest. 48 cords was a number that felt complete to her. 48 cords was what she could defend. 48 cords was what would have satisfied Margaret Thorne. But in the summer of 1889, something happened that changed the calculation entirely. Lightning struck the communal timber lot 3 miles east of Cutter's Bend, the forest land that belonged to no single person, but rather to the community as a whole, where every family had the right to cut wood for winter. The lightning started a fire that burned for 3 days and consumed approximately 2,000 acres of timber. The fire destroyed the old growth, the thick lodgepole pine and Douglas fir that were the backbone of winter preparation. It left behind only blackened stumps and ash, a landscape of charcoal and silence where there had once been a canopy so dense that snow barely reached the ground. Men who had cut wood in that forest for a decade stood at the edge of the burn and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. 2,000 acres of fuel had been reduced to carbon in 72 hours. When the fire was finally extinguished by a rain that came in the evening of the 3rd day, the town of Cutter's Bend faced a reality that no one had anticipated. There was no more shared timber. The nearest unburned timber suitable for cutting was 11 miles away, in a direction that required crossing a river and climbing into terrain that was increasingly difficult. Families would have to travel far to get their winter wood, and they would have to do it in the months when working the land and preparing for winter took every hour of daylight. By October of 1889, most families in Cutter's Bend had accumulated only 2 or 3 cords, fuel that would sustain them for perhaps 6 weeks if they were conservative. The winter arrived early and with terrible severity. The first major snow came on October 28th, and by November, the temperature had plummeted. By mid-November, it was clear that this would not be a mild winter. The cold held steady, dropping further as December arrived. By the time the year turned from 1889 to 1890, temperatures were reaching minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The town well froze solid. Livestock died in the fields and the pastures. Children huddled under every blanket the town possessed, and mothers burned not just wood, but fence posts, barn siding, furniture that had been brought from the east and was precious beyond measure. The stoves in the homes of Cutter's Bend went cold, one by one. First, the outlying homesteads, where families had always been last to stock up and first to run dry. Then the houses along the South Road, where the walls were thinner and the wind came hardest. Then the center of town, where even the merchant store, Perkins and Sons, the largest building in Cutter's Bend, sat dark and cold, its proprietor having burned the last of his inventory shelving the week before Christmas. Families moved into single rooms, abandoning the rest of their cabins to the cold, hanging blankets over doorways to trap whatever heat remained. People began to sicken. An old man named Hutchins died on January 15th, his body stiff with cold. A child developed pneumonia and lay in a bed that was no warmer than the ground outside. The Dahlgren boy, who was 7 years old, stopped speaking entirely and sat wrapped in a horse blanket, staring at the dead stove in his family's kitchen. A woman's fingers turned black from frostbite, and the doctor had nothing warm enough to treat her in. Desperation moved through the town like smoke, and it was into this desperation that Hannah Brindle emerged from her cabin at the end of January with news that would remake everything. She went to see Dr. Harrison, the only physician in Cutter's Bend, and she told him that she could provide firewood to any family that needed it. 1/3 cord per week, per household, delivered by sled. She had calculated the distribution carefully. She had 32 cords remaining in the vault. She had burned 16 cords for herself and for Thomas's memory in the years since she had arrived. 32 cords, divided into 1/3 cord portions, would sustain 26 households for 14 weeks. 14 weeks would take the town from the end of January through February and into March, when the thaw would begin. 14 weeks would get them through the worst of the winter. Dr. Harrison, who was a man of approximately 60 years with gray at his temples and an expression of perpetual sadness, sat in his office and listened to Hannah's proposal, and when she finished speaking, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "People will wonder why you have this." Hannah did not answer this as a question. She said, "I was taught by my grandmother how to prepare. My grandmother survived the Great Blizzard of 1873 in Duluth. She kept a rolling reserve of 6 years because cold is patient and will outlast every fire you light unless you stack faster than winter burns." Dr. Harrison nodded slowly. "We will owe you a debt," he said. "We will owe you everything." The distribution of wood began in the first week of February. Hannah and the doctor created a list of households in order of need. The families with the smallest children first, the elderly, those with members already suffering from the cold. Hannah would arrive at each home with her sled, heavy with wood, and she would unload 1/3 of a cord into the space by the door. She would stack it neatly against the wall, bark side up as her grandmother had taught her, and she would leave without accepting thanks or payment. The wood she delivered was beautiful in a way that only people who had suffered cold could appreciate. Each piece split clean and straight, each piece dry enough to crack when struck together, each piece seasoned to the pale gray of wood that had given up its water and was ready to become heat. Some families wept when they saw the sled coming up their path. Some families tried to offer her goods or coin or labor in return. The widow Marston offered a silver brooch that had belonged to her mother. The Halverson family offered to deed Hannah a half-acre of grazing land. Hannah refused everything. She moved through the town like a ghost, but a ghost made solid by firewood, a woman whose form had been shaped by years of labor into something that could not be declined. By the 3rd week of February, the children in Cutter's Bend had stopped coughing. By the end of February, color was returning to the faces of people who had been pale from hunger and cold. the stoves came back to life, and the town became, once again, a place where people could envision a future that extended beyond the next day, the next hour. It was on a cold morning in the middle of February, a day when the temperature had climbed only to -20, that Edna Poole came to Hannah's cabin. She came on foot, her wool skirts trailing through the snow, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her silver brooch catching what weak light fell from the gray sky. She brought with her 2 children, girls aged 9 and 11, both thin in the face, both shivering despite multiple layers of clothing. They were the daughters of Thomas Poole, Edna's dead brother, Hannah's dead husband, and Hannah recognized them immediately from their eyes, which held the shape of Thomas's gaze. Edna's face was a map of pride and desperation, a terrible mixture of the two, and when she reached the door of Hannah's cabin, she did not knock. She stood at the threshold and said, "I need firewood. I have nothing left." Hannah did not ask why Edna had not come weeks before, when other families had lined up to receive their share. Hannah did not ask why Edna had spent her own accumulated fuel caring for a household larger than most, and had used every stick before coming to ask for help. Hannah simply looked at Edna's pale face, at the trembling of the younger girl, at the way the older girl was trying to stand straighter than her body wanted to stand, and she turned back into the cabin. She filled a large sled with 1 full cord of wood, not 1/3 cord, which was the ration, but an entire cord. The wood was well seasoned, dense lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, split to the proper length, stacked so that any fire would burn long and steady. She loaded it in silence, and Edna watched in silence, and the 2 girls stood in the cold and did not speak. When the sled was fully loaded, Hannah said only, "This will heat your home for 6 weeks if you burn it carefully." Edna's pale gray eyes filled with tears, but she did not let them fall. She said, "I said terrible things about you." Hannah nodded, as if this was not a surprise, as if it was simply a fact that had always been understood. "Your nieces need to survive the winter," Hannah said. "So take this wood and build a good fire and keep them warm." Edna did not say, "Thank you." Perhaps she could not. But she reached out and took the rope handle of the sled, and she began to pull it, and the 2 girls walked beside her, back toward town in the gray afternoon light. When they had gone, Hannah stood in the snow for a long time without moving. The winter lasted until late March. The thaw came slowly at first, then with a rush, and by April the snow had retreated to the highest elevations, and Cutter's Bend was a town of mud and rushing water, and the smell of earth returning to life. Hannah had distributed approximately 24 cords in total, leaving her with 8 cords still remaining in the vault. She had become, without any effort on her part to be so, the person who had saved the town. But more importantly, she had become the person who had shown the town how to save itself. By the summer of 1890, 11 families in and around Cutter's Bend had begun construction on their own firewood vaults. The doctor had drawn up a plan based on Hannah's design, and he had made it available to anyone who wanted to copy it. The dimensions were identical, 40 feet long, 12 feet wide, 8 feet tall. The stacking method was the same. The idea of sorting wood by type, dense hardwood on the left wall for long overnight burns, lighter kindling wood on the right for quick morning fires, and of seasoning wood properly for a minimum of 8 months before burning, and of calculating need based on family size and climate and the thickness of cabin walls. All of this had been transmitted, like seed, from Hannah's accumulated knowledge into the broader community. The criss-cross stacking method that Hannah had used, alternating layers at 90 degrees for maximum airflow, became the standard in Cutter's Bend. Families who had previously thrown green rounds into loose piles against their cabin walls now built proper stacks with stone pier foundations and bark-side-up top layers. The change was quiet but total. By the summer of 1891, there were 3 more vaults under construction. By the following summer, 5 more families had begun the work. The timber lot that had burned grew back, slowly, but it would not be productive for another decade. When it did return to productivity, the families of Cutter's Bend would not depend upon it as they had before. They would depend instead upon their own preparation, their own labor, their own willingness to work toward a future that was not yet visible. Edna Poole came to see Hannah in the spring of 1890, after the worst of the cold had passed. She brought a pie that she had made herself, dense with apples she had preserved the autumn before. The pie was an offering, Hannah understood, of something that Edna could not say with words. Hannah accepted the pie and set it on the table in her cabin, and she offered Edna a seat by the fire, which Edna declined. Edna stood, instead, in the narrow space between the door and the wall, her shawl drawn around her shoulders, and she said, "I was wrong about you." Hannah did not respond, because there was nothing to respond to that would honor the truth of the moment. Edna had been wrong, and Hannah had known she was wrong, and neither of them needed the word spoken to change the fact that was understood between them. Edna left shortly after, and she did not return. But when Hannah went to the town in the following months, she noticed that Edna no longer spoke the things she had spoken before. The woman who had called her a wood-hoarding fool now said nothing to her at all. In the following years, as Hannah continued to live in the trapper's cabin and to maintain her firewood vault and to give freely from her stores to any family that faced unexpected cold, the reputation that Edna had spread, the story of the widow made mad by grief, the woman obsessed with meaningless repetition, was gradually replaced by a different understanding. People understood, eventually, that Hannah Brindle had not been engaged in madness. She had been engaged in prophecy. She had seen a winter that others could not see. She had built a shelter from a cold that no one else had anticipated. She had stacked wood with the hands of a person who knew something about what was coming, the same hands that had held her grandmother's birch bark journal in Duluth, the same hands that had gripped a 6-pound maul in the autumn of 1886 while Edna Poole watched and called her a fool, and she had been right. The wood heeded her 3 times. The old saying went, once when she chopped it, once when she stacked it, and once when she burned it. Hannah Brindle had been warm since the first swing of the axe. She would always be warm because she had understood something that many people never understand. That the greatest abundance comes not from luck, not from accident, not from the kindness of circumstance, but from the accumulated power of small, repeated acts. Every log split was a decision. Every log stacked was a prayer. Every cord seasoned was a word spoken to the future, a message to the cold. You will come, but I will be ready. And when the cold came, and the town was desperate, and Edna Poole arrived at her door with her dead brother's daughters shivering in the snow, Hannah had been ready. That was not madness. That was something far more powerful than madness. That was a woman who had listened to her grandmother, who had studied the shape of the future, who had worked for 4 years without complaint or explanation or need for understanding from anyone else. Hannah Brindle had stacked firewood while people mocked her, And the day had come when the wood was needed, and it was there. The rest, the gratitude, the changed perception, the spread of her design across the territory, was simply what happened afterward, in the spring when the thaw came and people could see, finally, what had always been true. That Hannah had been building not a monument to obsession, but a library of warmth, a vault of provision, a shelter against the cold that never stops coming.